Young black man married an old rich woman for money, but she found out his plan. The opulent ballroom of the Regal Grove Country Club sparkled under the warm glow of crystal chandeliers. The annual charity gala was in full swing, with Boston's elite mingling, sipping champagne, and engaging in the delicate dance of high society small talk. Among the sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, two figures stood out, not for their attire, 'twas impeccable, but for the stark contrasts they presented. 82-year-old Evelyn Whitmore, widow of the late shipping magnate Harold Whitmore, cut an elegant figure in a deep purple gown that complemented her silver hair, styled in a classic chignon. Despite her advanced years, Evelyn carried herself with the poise and confidence of a woman who had navigated the treacherous waters of high society for decades. By her side, looking somewhat out of place despite his perfectly tailored tuxedo, stood Jamal Foster, a strikingly handsome black man in his late 20s. His dark skin and athletic build drew curious glances from the predominantly white elderly crowd. Some whispered behind their hands, eyebrows raised in speculation about the nature of the relationship between the enigmatic young man and one of Boston's wealthiest widows. Jamal leaned in close to Evelyn, his charm on full display as he whispered something that made her laugh, a sound light and girlish, belying her years. As they made their way through the crowd, Evelyn's arthritic hand rested on Jamal's strong arm, a picture of May-December companionship that set tongues wagging throughout the ballroom. "Evelyn, darling," a shrill voice cut through the murmur of conversation. Margaret Astor, a contemporary of Evelyn's and longtime frenemy, approached with a predatory smile. "How lovely to see you. And who is this charming young man?" Evelyn's grip on Jamal's arm tightened almost imperceptibly. "Margaret, how nice. This is Jamal Foster, my companion for the evening." "Jamal, dear, this is Margaret Astor, an old friend." Jamal flashed a dazzling smile, bowing slightly as he took Margaret's proffered hand. "A pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Astor. I've heard so much about you from Evelyn." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, her smile not quite reaching them. "Have you indeed? How fascinating. And how did you and Evelyn meet, Mr. Foster? I don't believe I've seen you at any of our functions before." Before Jamal could respond, Evelyn smoothly interjected. "Jamal is a graduate student at Boston University. We met at a fundraiser for their scholarship program. He's doing fascinating work on urban development and community engagement." As Evelyn spoke, Jamal's mind wandered back to their first meeting, so different from the polished lie Evelyn was now spinning. 6 months earlier, on a crisp autumn day, Jamal had been working his shift at the Daily Grind, a trendy coffee shop in downtown Boston. The lunch rush had just ended, and he was wiping down tables when the bell over the door chimed. Looking up, Jamal saw an elderly woman enter, leaning heavily on an ornate cane. Despite her obvious wealth, evident in her tailored wool coat and the large diamond glittering on her left hand, there was a vulnerability in her eyes that tugged at Jamal's heart. "Welcome to the Daily Grind," Jamal said, flashing his most charming smile. "What can I get for you today?" The woman peered up at the menu board, squinting slightly. "Oh, dear," he murmured. "I'm afraid I've forgotten my reading glasses. Would you mind terribly reading the menu to me, young man?" "Of course not, ma'am," Jamal replied, launching into a description of their specialty drinks and pastries. As he spoke, the woman's eyes never left his face, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. When he finished, she nodded decisively. "I'll have a simple cup of Earl Grey, please, and perhaps one of those almond croissants you mentioned." "Excellent choice," Jamal said. "Would you like that for here or to go?" "Oh, for here, I think," the woman replied. "It's such a lovely day, and I so rarely get out anymore. Would you be a dear and help me to a table?" Jamal quickly prepared her order and then gently guided her to a small table by the window. As he set down her tea and croissant, the woman reached out and patted his hand. "Thank you, young man. You've been so kind. Might I know your name?" "Jamal, ma'am. Jamal Foster." "Well, Jamal Foster, I'm Evelyn Whitmore. It's a pleasure to meet you." As Jamal turned to leave, Evelyn spoke again. "Jamal, if you're not too busy, would you care to join me for a moment? It's been so long since I've had the pleasure of conversation with someone new." Jamal hesitated. His shift wasn't over, and the manager frowned on employees socializing with customers. Something in Evelyn's eyes, a mixture of hope and loneliness, made him nod. "I'd be happy to, Mrs. Whitmore. Just let me check with my manager." To Jamal's surprise, his usually stern manager took one look at Evelyn and nodded approvingly. "Take your break, Foster. I'll cover the counter." And so began an unlikely friendship. Jamal found himself drawn in by Evelyn's sharp wit and the wealth of stories she had to tell. For her part, Evelyn seemed to blossom in Jamal's presence, her eyes sparkling with an energy that belied her years. As the weeks passed, Evelyn became a regular at the daily grind, always timing her visits to coincide with Jamal's shifts. They would chat about everything from Jamal's struggles to pay for college to Evelyn's adventures traveling the world with her late husband. It was during one of these conversations, about 2 months after their first meeting, that Evelyn made an offer that would change the course of Jamal's life. "Jamal, dear," she said, her voice hesitant, "I hope you won't think me presumptuous, but I have a proposition for you." Jamal leaned in, curious. "What kind of proposition, Mrs. Whitmore?" Evelyn took a deep breath. "As you know, I'm not as young as I used to be. My children are all grown with families of their own, and I find myself rather lonely. I was wondering if you might consider becoming my companion." Jamal blinked, surprised. "Your companion?" "Yes, dear. I would of course provide you with a generous stipend, enough to cover your tuition and living expenses, with plenty left over. In return, I'd ask for your company at social events, assistance with some day-to-day tasks, and simply, your friendship." As Evelyn spoke, Jamal's mind raced. The offer was tempting, more than tempting. His scholarship only covered a portion of his tuition, and between classes and his job at the coffee shop, he was barely staying afloat. The thought of having his expenses covered, of being able to focus on his studies without the constant stress of financial worry, was almost too good to be true. But a small voice in the back of his mind whispered a warning. Was it right to accept such an offer? What would people think, seeing a young black man constantly in the company of a wealthy white woman old enough to be his grandmother? Evelyn, seeming to sense his hesitation, reached out and patted his hand. "You don't have to answer right away, dear. Take some time to think it over. And please, don't feel obligated. Our friendship means a great deal to me, regardless of your decision." Jamal nodded, his thoughts in turmoil. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore. I'll definitely think about it." As he watched Evelyn leave the coffee shop that day, leaning on her cane but with a newfound spring in her step, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the precipice of something life-changing. Little did he know just how prophetic that feeling would prove to be. Back in the present, at the Regal Grove Country Club Gala, Jamal tuned back into the conversation just in time to hear Margaret Astor's parting shot. "Well, Evelyn, it's certainly progressive of you to take such an interest in young Mr. Foster's education. I do hope you know what you're doing." As Margaret sashayed away, Evelyn's grip on Jamal's arm tightened. "Pay her no mind, dear," he murmured. "Margaret has always been a bit of a busybody." Jamal nodded. He couldn't shake off a feeling of unease. He'd known from the start that his relationship with Evelyn would raise eyebrows, but being here, surrounded by the cream of Boston society, the reality of their situation hit home in a way it never had before. As they made their way to their table for dinner, Jamal caught sight of their reflection in one of the ballroom's ornate mirrors. The contrast was stark. Evelyn, petite and silver-haired, a grande dame of Boston society, and himself, young, black, and out of place in this world of old money and older prejudices. For a moment, Jamal felt a pang of guilt. Evelyn had been nothing but kind to him, generous beyond his wildest dreams. She'd opened doors for him that he never even knew existed. And yet, as he looked at their reflection, as he felt the weight of curious and often disapproving stares, Jamal couldn't help but wonder. Had he made a terrible mistake? And more importantly, what would happen when Evelyn inevitably discovered the truth about his motivations? As they took their seats at the table, Evelyn smiled up at him, her eyes twinkling with genuine affection. Jamal returned the smile automatically, even as his heart raced with a mixture of guilt, fear, and something else. Something he wasn't quite ready to name. The evening stretched ahead of them, glittering and fraught with potential. And as the first course was served, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that he was balanced on a knife's edge, with happiness and disaster equally possible outcome. Little did he know, the events set in motion that night would lead to revelations and consequences beyond anything he could have imagined. In the months following the charity gala, Jamal found himself increasingly immersed in Evelyn's world. What had started as a simple arrangement, companionship in exchange for financial support, evolved into something far more complex. Jamal's days were now filled with a whirlwind of social engagements, cultural events, and quiet evenings spent in Evelyn's sprawling Beacon Hill mansion. As winter melted into spring, Jamal couldn't help but notice a change in Evelyn. The lonely, somewhat fragile woman he'd first met at the daily grind had blossomed into a vibrant, energetic presence. Her eyes sparkled with newfound joy, and she laughed more freely than Jamal had ever seen. For his part, Jamal found himself genuinely enjoying Evelyn's company. Her sharp wit and wealth of life experiences made for fascinating conversations. She regaled him with stories of her travels around the world, her experiences in the civil rights era, and the challenges she'd faced as a woman in Boston's male-dominated high society. But beneath the surface of their growing friendship, Jamal grappled with conflicting emotions. On one hand, he was grateful for the opportunities Evelyn had given him. With her support, he'd been able to focus fully on his studies, and his grades had improved dramatically. He no longer had to worry about making rent or choosing between textbooks and meals. On the other hand, the guilt of his initial motivations gnawed at him. He'd entered into this arrangement with the clear intention of using Evelyn for her money. But as he got to know her, as he saw the positive impact his presence had on her life, that goal became increasingly uncomfortable. One warm evening in late May, Jamal and Evelyn sat on the terrace of her home, watching the sun set over the Boston skyline. Evelyn sipped a glass of white wine, while Jamal nursed a sparkling water. "Jamal, dear," Evelyn said, her voice soft but serious, "there's something I'd like to discuss with you." Jamal felt a flutter of anxiety in his stomach. Had she discovered his original intentions? Was she about to end their arrangement? "Of course, Evelyn," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "What's on your mind?" Evelyn set down her wine glass and turned to face him fully. "These past months with you have been some of the happiest of my life. You've brought a joy and energy into my world that I thought was long gone." Jamal swallowed hard, unsure where this was going. "I know our arrangement has been unconventional," Evelyn continued, "and I know there are many who don't understand or approve of our relationship, but I've come to care for you deeply, Jamal. More than I ever expected to care for anyone again at my age." She reached out and took his hand in hers, her soft, age-spotted skin a stark contrast to his smooth, dark complexion. "What I'm trying to say, my dear, is that I would like to make our arrangement more permanent. Jamal, would you consider marrying me?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Jamal felt as though the world had suddenly tilted on its axis. Marriage? To Evelyn? The idea was so far from anything he'd ever considered that for a moment he couldn't form a coherent thought. "Evelyn, I don't know what to say," finally managed. "Are you sure about this? I mean, the age difference, the social implications." Evelyn's grip on his hand tightened. "I'm more than sure, Jamal. I know it's not a conventional proposal. I'm not offering you the kind of marriage most young men dream of, but I'm offering you security, companionship, and yes, love, in my own way. In return, I'm asking for your continued presence in my life, friendship, and your support as I navigate these twilight years." As Evelyn spoke, Jamal's mind raced. This was beyond anything he'd imagined when he'd first agreed to be Evelyn's companion. Marriage would mean a level of commitment, of entanglement in Evelyn's life and world that both thrilled and terrified him. And yet, wasn't this exactly the kind of opportunity he'd been hoping for? Marriage to Evelyn would secure his financial future in a way that went far beyond tuition and living expenses. As her husband, he would be positioned to inherit her considerable fortune. The thought made him feel slightly ill. He'd grown to care for Evelyn, to value her friendship and companionship. The idea of essentially waiting for her to die so he could inherit her wealth was deeply uncomfortable. But another part of him, part that remembered long nights of hunger and the constant stress of living paycheck to paycheck, whispered that this was his chance. His one opportunity to secure a future free from the financial struggles that had defined his life so far. "Evelyn, I'm honored," Jamal finally said. "But this is a big decision. Can I have some time to think about it?" Evelyn smiled, patting his hand gently. "Of course, my dear. Take all the time you need. I understand this isn't a decision to be made lightly." As Jamal left Evelyn's house that night, his mind was in turmoil. He walked the streets of Boston for hours, weighing his options, considering the potential consequences of his decision. On one side was the promise of financial security, of opportunities he'd never dreamed possible. On the other was the weight of guilt, the knowledge that he'd be entering into a marriage under false pretenses. As dawn broke over the city, Jamal found himself standing in front of the Daily Grind, coffee shop where he'd first met Evelyn. It felt like a lifetime ago. He'd been a struggling student then, unsure of his future. Now, he stood on the precipice of a decision that would change the course of his life forever. With a deep breath, Jamal made his choice. He would accept Evelyn's proposal, but he made a silent vow to himself. He would be the best husband he could be to her. He would honor her, care for her, and do everything in his power to make her remaining years happy ones. It was the least he could do in exchange for the future she was offering him. 2 months later, on a bright summer day, Jamal Foster and Evelyn Whitmore were married in a small private ceremony in the garden of her Beacon Hill home. The guest list was limited to a handful of Evelyn's closest friends and Jamal's mother, Sarah, who had flown in from Chicago for the occasion. As they exchanged vows, Jamal looked into Evelyn's eyes and saw a genuine happiness there. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this unorthodox union could work out for both of them. The reception that followed was a subdued affair, but tension simmered beneath the surface. Jamal couldn't help but notice the whispered conversations, sidelong glances from Evelyn's friends. Even in this intimate gathering, their relationship was a source of fascination and, in some cases, disapproval. Jamal's mother, Sarah, pulled him aside during the reception, face a mask of concern. "Jamal, baby, are you sure about this?" she whispered. "I know you said this is what you want, but she's older than I am, son. What kind of life can you have with her?" Jamal squeezed his mother's hand reassuringly. "I know it's not conventional, Mom, but Evelyn and I care for each other. She's given me opportunities I never thought I'd have. I want to be there for her, to make her happy." Sarah searched her son's face, not entirely convinced. "Just promise me you know what you're doing, Jamal. I don't want to see you get hurt." "I promise, Mom," Jamal replied, hoping his voice sounded more confident than he felt. "Everything's going to be fine." As the reception wound down and the last of the guests departed, Jamal and Evelyn found themselves alone in the grand house that was now their shared home. Evelyn turned to Jamal, a soft smile on her face. "Well, my dear husband," she said, the word sounding strange and wonderful on her lips. "Shall we begin our life together?" Jamal nodded, pushing down the last vestiges of doubt. This was his life now. For better or worse, he was Evelyn Whitmore's husband, and he was determined to make the best of it. But as he followed Evelyn up the grand staircase to the master bedroom, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into a role he wasn't fully prepared for. The weight of his secrets, of his original motivations, pressed heavily on his shoulders. How long could he maintain this charade? And what would happen when the truth inevitably came to light? As Jamal closed the bedroom door behind them, he silently prayed that he would find the strength to be the husband Evelyn deserved, and that somehow this unconventional marriage would lead to happiness for them both. Little did he know, true test of their relationship was yet to come. The months ahead would bring challenges, revelations, and consequences that neither Jamal nor Evelyn could have anticipated on this, their wedding day. First few months of Jamal and Evelyn's marriage passed in a whirlwind of activity. Evelyn, energized by her new status as a newlywed, threw herself into the social scene with renewed vigor. Charity galas, art openings, and dinner parties filled their calendar, with Jamal dutifully by her side at each event. For Jamal, this new life was both exhilarating and exhausting. He found himself thrust into a world of wealth and privilege that he had only ever observed from the outside. Opulent homes, the extravagant parties, casual discussions of vacations to exotic locales, it was all so far removed from his previous existence that at times he felt as though he were playing a part in an elaborate stage production. But as the novelty began to wear off, Jamal found himself grappling with the realities of his situation. The whispers and sidelong glances that had begun at their wedding had not subsided. If anything, they had intensified. At every social gathering, he could feel the weight of curious and often judgmental stares. One particularly trying evening, at a fundraiser for the Boston Symphony Orchestra, Jamal found himself cornered by Theodore Cabot III, contemporary of Evelyn's and a pillar of Boston's old money society. "So, young man," Theodore said, his voice dripping with barely concealed disdain, "tell me, what exactly are your intentions with our dear Evelyn?" Jamal fought to keep his expression neutral. "My intentions, Mr. Cabot, are to be a good husband to Evelyn and to make her happy." Theodore's eyes narrowed. "Come now, we're both men of the world. Surely you don't expect us to believe that a young man like yourself would marry a woman of Evelyn's age out of love?" The implication was clear, and it struck too close to home for Jamal's comfort. Before he could formulate a response, he felt a gentle hand on his arm. Evelyn had appeared at his side, her face a mask of polite sociability, but her eyes flashing with anger. "Theodore, darling," she said, her voice sweet, with an edge of steel, "I do hope you're not interrogating my husband. Jamal has brought more joy into my life than I ever thought possible at my age. Now, you'll excuse us, I believe they're about to begin the auction." As Evelyn steered him away, Jamal felt a surge of guilt. Evelyn's defense of him, her obvious affection, made his original motivations for their marriage feel even more shameful. That night, as they returned home, Jamal found himself unable to meet Evelyn's eyes. The weight of his secrets pressed heavily upon him. "Evelyn," he said quietly as they entered the foyer of their Beacon Hill mansion, "can we talk?" Evelyn turned to him, concern evident in her eyes. "Of course, dear. What's on your mind?" Jamal took a deep breath, steeling himself. I need to tell you something about why I agreed to marry you." But before he could continue, Evelyn held up a hand, stopping him. "Jamal, my dear, let me spare you the difficult. I know why you married me." Jamal felt his heart drop. You do?" Evelyn smiled, a mix of sadness and understanding in her eyes. "Of course I do. I'm old, Jamal, not naive. I know that a young man like yourself doesn't marry a woman my age without certain motivation." Jamal felt as though the floor had dropped out from under him. "Evelyn, It's all right, dear," Evelyn continued. "I entered into this marriage with my eyes open. I knew what I was offering you, financial security, opportunities you might not have had otherwise. And in return, I get your companionship, your youthful energy, a reason to engage with life again. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement, wouldn't you agree?" Jamal nodded numbly, unable to form words. He had been prepared to confess, to face Evelyn's anger or disappointment. But this calm acceptance, this acknowledgement of the transactional nature of their relationship, caught him completely off guard. I don't know what to say," finally managed. Evelyn patted his cheek gently. "You don't need to say anything, my dear. Just continue being the wonderful companion you've been. Now I think I'll retire for the evening. Been a long day." As Evelyn ascended the grand staircase, leaving Jamal alone in the foyer, he felt a curious mix of relief and discomfort. Evelyn knew. She had always known. And yet, somehow, this knowledge didn't make him feel any better about the situation. In the weeks that followed, Jamal found himself increasingly restless. Evelyn's acceptance of their arrangement, far from putting him at ease, had only intensified his feelings of guilt. He threw himself into his studies with renewed vigor, spending long hours at the library, often returning home late in the evening. Evelyn, for her part, seemed content with their life together. She continued to shower Jamal with affection and generosity, never once indicating that she was anything less than satisfied with their marriage. But as spring turned to summer, a new complication arose. Evelyn's children, who had been conspicuously absent from their small wedding ceremony, began to take an interest in their mother's new marriage. It started with phone calls, probing, suspicious conversations that Evelyn tried to keep private, but that Jamal couldn't help overhearing. Then came the unexpected visits. always when Evelyn was out at her various social engagements. Evelyn's eldest daughter, Catherine, was the first to confront Jamal directly. She arrived one sunny afternoon, her Mercedes purring to a stop in the circular driveway of the Beacon Hill mansion. Jamal, who had been studying in the library, answered the door to find a woman in her late 50s, impeccably dressed and wearing an expression of thinly veiled hostility. "So," she said, brushing past Jamal into the foyer, "you're the boy who's ensnared my mother." Jamal bristled at her tone but forced himself to remain calm. "I'm Jamal Foster, Evelyn's husband, and you must be Catherine. Evelyn has told me a lot about you." Catherine's eyes narrowed. "Has she now?" "Well, she hasn't told me nearly enough about you. Let's rectify that, shall we?" What followed was an hour-long interrogation that left Jamal feeling drained and defensive. Catherine probed into every aspect of his life: background, his education, his career aspirations. With each question, her skepticism and disapproval became more apparent. "Let's cut to the chase, Mr. Foster," Catherine finally said, her voice cold. "What exactly are you after? Is it my mother's money, her social standing? Because I can assure you, if you think you're going to take advantage of her, you've got another thing coming." Jamal felt a surge of anger, both at Catherine's accusations and at the kernel of truth they contained. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, fighting to keep his voice level, "I care deeply for your mother. Our relationship may not be conventional, but it is based on mutual respect and affection." Catherine scoffed. "Affection? Please. My mother is old enough to be your grandmother. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending this is anything other than a calculated move on your part." Before Jamal could respond, they heard the sound of a key in the lock. Evelyn entered, her face lighting up at the sight of her daughter. "Catherine, what a lovely surprise. I see you've met Jamal." The tension in the room was palpable, but both Jamal and Catherine managed to plaster on smiles for Evelyn's benefit. As Catherine made her excuses and left, shooting one last suspicious glance at Jamal, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of his troubles with Evelyn's family. That night, as Jamal lay awake in the guest room that had become his de facto bedroom, he found himself at a crossroad. The life he had envisioned when he agreed to marry Evelyn, one of comfort, opportunity, and yes, wealth, now seemed fraught with complications he hadn't anticipated. He thought of his mother, of the hope in her eyes when he told her about the opportunities his marriage to Evelyn had opened up for him. He thought of his friends from his old life, of the pride and envy in their voices when they spoke of his lucky break. But he also thought of Evelyn, her kindness and generosity, the genuine affection she seemed to feel for him. And he thought of Catherine's accusations, of the suspicion and hostility he was likely to face from the rest of Evelyn's family and social circle. As dawn broke over Boston, Jamal came to a decision. Couldn't continue like this, living a lie, no matter how comfortable that lie might be. He needed to come clean to Evelyn, tell her the whole truth about his initial motivations for agreeing to their arrangement. But as he steeled himself for this difficult conversation, Jamal couldn't have known that Evelyn had secrets of her own. Secrets that were about to turn his world upside down once again. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the foundations of their unconventional marriage and force both Jamal and Evelyn to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and each other. As the Boston summer heat intensified, so too did the tension simmering beneath the surface of the Whitmore Foster household, building towards an inevitable explosion that would change everything. The Boston summer had reached its sweltering peak, the heat hanging heavy over the city like a wool blanket. Inside the cool, air-conditioned confines of the Whitmore Foster mansion, a different kind of heat was building. The simmering tension between Jamal and Evelyn that had been growing for weeks was about to boil over. Jamal had spent days working up the courage for this conversation, rehearsing his words, trying to find the right way to confess the full truth about his initial motivations for their marriage. He knew it would be painful, knew it might even end their relationship, but he couldn't bear the weight of his deception any longer. On a sultry Thursday afternoon, Jamal found Evelyn in her study, poring over financial documents. The sight gave him pause. It was rare to see Evelyn engaged in anything related to her vast wealth. Usually, She left such matters to her army of financial advisors and lawyers. Evelyn, Jamal said softly, his heart pounding. Do you have a moment? There's something important I need to discuss with you. Evelyn looked up, a strange expression flickering across her face before she smoothed it into a smile. Of course, dear. I was just finishing up here. Why don't we move to the sitting room? It's more comfortable. As they settled into the plush armchairs of the sitting room, Jamal couldn't help but notice that Evelyn seemed different. There was a tension in her posture, a guardedness in her eyes that he'd never seen before. Evelyn, Jamal began, his mouth dry. I haven't been entirely honest with you about why I agreed to this marriage. Evelyn's expression didn't change, but her hands, folded neatly in her lap, tightened almost imperceptibly. Go on, she said, her voice carefully neutral. Jamal took a deep breath. When we first met, when you offered to be my patron, I saw it as an opportunity, a way out of the financial struggles I'd been facing. When you proposed marriage, I thought about the security it would bring, the opportunities it would open up for. Paused, watching Evelyn's face for a reaction. She remained impassive. I know you said you understood my motivations, but the truth is, I initially saw our marriage as a transaction, a way to secure my future. Jamal's voice cracked slightly. But Evelyn, you have to believe me, that's not how I feel now. I've come to care for you deeply. You're not just my benefactor, you're my friend, my partner. Stop. Evelyn's voice cut through his words like a knife. That's quite enough, Jamal. Jamal fell silent, his heart sinking. This was it, the moment he'd been dreading. Evelyn would tell him she was disgusted with him, that their marriage was over. But what Evelyn said next caught him completely off guard. I know all of this, Jamal. I've always known. Her voice was calm, almost eerily so. In fact, it's precisely why I chose you. Jamal blinked, confusion replacing his fear. What do you mean, you chose me? Evelyn sighed, suddenly looking every one of her 82 years. I suppose it's time for me to be honest as well. Jamal, our meeting at that coffee shop wasn't a coincidence. I'd been watching you for weeks, evaluating you, determining if you were the right candidate. Candidate? Or what? Jamal felt as though he'd stepped into some bizarre alternate reality. For this, Evelyn gestured around them. For marriage. For the role you've been playing these past months. She stood, moving to the window, her back to Jamal. See, Jamal, I needed someone like you. Someone young, ambitious, with a history of financial struggle. Someone who would be tempted by what I could offer, who would agree to an arrangement that might seem unconventional. Jamal's mind was reeling. But why? Evelyn, I don't understand. Evelyn turned back to him, her eyes sharp. Because, my dear, I needed to protect my legacy. My children, Catherine, Thomas, Elizabeth, they've become entitled, lazy. They've been waiting for years for me to die so they can inherit my fortune, but they don't deserve it. They haven't earned it. She moved back to her chair, sitting down with a grace that belied her age. So I devised a plan. I would find someone like you to marry. Someone who could be molded, guided. Someone who would inherit my wealth but use it the way I see fit. Jamal felt as though the floor had dropped out from under him. You've been manipulating me? This whole time? Manipulating is such an ugly word, Evelyn said, waving a hand dismissively. I prefer to think of it as mutual benefit. You get the financial security and opportunities you've always wanted. I get the assurance that my fortune will be used to continue my philanthropic works, to make a real difference in the world. Jamal stood abruptly, his head spinning. I can't believe this. All this time, I've been feeling guilty about my motivations, and you've been playing me like a chess piece. Evelyn's expression softened slightly. Jamal, please try to understand. I do care for you, in my way. You've been a wonderful companion, and I've enjoyed our time together immensely. But we both entered into this arrangement with our eyes open. We both had our reasons. But it wasn't real, Jamal said, his voice barely above a whisper. None of it was real. Wasn't it? Evelyn challenged. Conversations we've had, the experiences we've shared, were they not real? The joy you've brought into my life, the opportunities I've given you, are they somehow lessened because we both had ulterior motives? Jamal sank back into his chair, overwhelmed. He thought back over the months of their marriage, the laughter, the shared confidences, the quiet moments of companionship. Had it all been a lie? "What happens now?" he finally asked, his voice hollow. Evelyn leaned forward, her eyes intent on his face. "That, my dear, is up to you. We can continue as we have been, you as my husband and heir, me as your benefactor and guide. Or, Jamal prompted when she trailed off. Or you can walk away. Right now. I won't try to stop you." Evelyn's voice was calm, but there was a hint of challenge in her eyes. "But if you leave with nothing. No money, no connections, no opportunities. You'll go back to the life you had before, as if none of this ever happened." Jamal felt as though he were standing on the edge of a precipice. On one side was the life he'd known with Evelyn, comfortable, privileged, but built on a foundation of mutual deception. On the other was a return to struggle, to uncertainty, perhaps a chance at a life lived on his own terms. As he wrestled with this impossible choice, a new voice cut through the tension in the room. "I think that's quite enough, Mother." Jamal and Evelyn both turned in shock to see Catherine standing in the doorway, her face a mask of cold fury. "How long have you been there?" Evelyn demanded, her composure slipping for the first time. "Long enough," Catherine replied, stepping into the room. "Long enough to hear how you've been plotting to disinherit your own children. Long enough to hear how you've manipulated this young man for your own ends." She turned to Jamal, her expression softening slightly. "I owe you an apology, Mr. Foster. It seems I misjudged you. You're as much a victim in my mother's schemes as the rest of us." Jamal could only nod numbly, still trying to process everything that had happened in the last few minutes. Catherine turned back to her mother, her voice hard. "This ends now, Mother. I'm calling the family lawyer. We'll see what the courts have to say about your mental competency to manage your own affairs." Evelyn's face drained of color. "You wouldn't dare." "Watch me," Catherine shot back. She pulled out her phone and began dialing. As mother and daughter faced off, their voices rising in argument, Jamal felt as though he were watching a scene in a play. A drama he was no longer a part of. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Regardless of Evelyn's machinations or Catherine's intervention, he was an outsider here. He always had been. Without a word, Jamal stood and walked out of the room. Neither Evelyn nor Catherine seemed to notice his departure. Too engrossed in their own confrontation, he made his way up to the guest room that had been his bedroom for the duration of his marriage. With mechanical efficiency, he began to pack his few personal belongings. The expensive clothes Evelyn had bought him, the watch, cufflinks, he left them all behind. They had never really been his, anyway. As he zipped up his old duffel bag, the same one he'd brought with him when he first moved into this mansion, Jamal caught sight of his reflection in the ornate mirror above the dresser. He hardly recognized the man staring back at him. With one last look around the room, Jamal shouldered his bag and walked out, closing the door softly behind him. He made his way down the grand staircase, the sounds of Evelyn and Catherine's ongoing argument echoing from the sitting room. At the front door, he paused. Should he say goodbye? Try to explain? But what was there to say, really? In the end, Jamal simply opened the door and stepped out into the sweltering Boston afternoon. As he walked down the tree-lined street, away from the mansion and the life he'd thought he wanted, he felt a curious mix of loss and liberation. He had no idea what the future held, where he would go or what he would do. But for the first time in months, maybe years, Jamal felt as though he could breathe freely. He had entered into his marriage with Evelyn, hoping to secure his future. Instead, he'd lost himself. Now, walking away from it all, he had a chance to find himself again. As Jamal reached the end of the street, he turned back for one last look at the Whitmore mansion. It stood there, grand and imposing, a symbol of wealth and privilege. But to Jamal, it now looked like a beautiful cage, one he was glad to be free of. With a deep breath, Jamal turned away and kept walking. The future was uncertain, but it was his own. And for now, that was enough. The months following Jamal's abrupt departure from the Whitmore mansion were a whirlwind of change and self-discovery. He had left with nothing but a duffel bag of old clothes and a head full of conflicting emotions. The Boston summer had faded into autumn, and as the leaves changed color, so too did Jamal's perspective on his life and his future. Initially, Jamal had struggled. He'd grown accustomed to the comfort and security of life with Evelyn, and the sudden return to financial instability was a harsh awakening. He'd crashed on friends' couches, picked up odd jobs, and even considered dropping out of his graduate program at Boston University. But as the initial shock wore off, Jamal found himself experiencing a kind of freedom he hadn't felt in years. Without the weight of deception and the gilded cage of his marriage to Evelyn, he was free to rediscover who he truly was and what he really wanted from life. It was during this period of soul-searching that Jamal reconnected with his roots. He reached out to his mother, Sarah, confessing everything that had happened. To his surprise and relief, she didn't judge him. Instead, she offered the unconditional love and support he so desperately needed. "Baby," he said during one of their long phone conversations, "we all make mistakes. What matters is what you learn from them and how you move forward." Those words became a mantra for Jamal as he worked to rebuild his life. He threw himself into his studies with renewed vigor, no longer taking his education for granted. He took on a part-time job at a community center in his old neighborhood, working with underprivileged youth. The work was challenging but rewarding, reminding Jamal of the person he'd been before wealth and status had clouded his judgment. As for Evelyn and the Whitmore family, Jamal heard only snippets of information through the grapevine. Catherine had indeed followed through on her threat to challenge Evelyn's competency. The ensuing legal battle had become something of a society scandal, with Boston's elite taking sides and gossip running rampant. Jamal did his best to stay out of it, declining interviews and avoiding the parts of town where he might run into familiar faces from his old life. But he couldn't help feeling a twinge of sadness for Evelyn. Despite her manipulation, he had grown to care for her, and the thought of her facing such public humiliation in her twilight years was painful. It was a crisp November day, nearly 6 months after Jamal had walked out of the Whitmore mansion, when an unexpected visitor turned up at the community center where he worked. Jamal was in the middle of helping a group of teenagers with their college applications, when one of his coworkers poked her head into the room. "Jamal? There's someone here to see you. Says it's important." Curious and a little apprehensive, Jamal excused himself and made his way to the front desk. His steps faltered when he saw who was waiting for him. Catherine Whitmore stood in the center's modest lobby, looking as elegant and out of place as an orchid in a dandelion field. But there was something different about her demeanor, a softness that hadn't been there before, a hint of uncertainty in her usually confident stance. "Mr. Foster," she said as Jamal approached, "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Jamal shook his head, still too surprised by her presence to form words. "I've been trying to track you down for weeks," Catherine continued. "We, that is, my siblings and I, we owe you an apology." Of all the things Jamal had expected her to say, this wasn't one of them. "An apology?" he echoed, confused. Catherine nodded, her composure slipping slightly. "May we talk somewhere private?" Jamal led her to a small conference room, closing the door behind them. As they sat across from each other at the battered old table, Jamal was struck by how different this scene was from their last encounter in the opulent Whitmore mansion. "Mr. Foster." "Jamal?" Catherine began. "I've spent the last few months learning some hard truths about my family, about my mother, and about myself. The legal proceedings, they brought a lot of things to light." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. "My mother, it turns out, had reason to doubt our worthiness as heirs. We, my siblings and I, we haven't always been the people she raised us to be. We've taken her generosity for granted, squandered opportunities, focused on our own pleasure rather than the responsibilities that come with the privilege." Jamal listened in stunned silence as Catherine continued. "When I confronted her that day, I thought I was protecting our family legacy. Instead, I was just proving her right about us." Catherine's voice cracked slightly. "The things she said about us during the competency hearings, they were harsh but not entirely untrue." "What happened?" Jamal asked softly. "With the hearings, I mean." Catherine gave a rueful smile. "Mother may be getting on in years, but her mind is as sharp as ever. She ran circles around our lawyers. In the end, the judge not only ruled her competent, but commended her foresight in trying to ensure her wealth would be used responsibly." She leaned forward, her eyes intent on Jamal's face. "But that's not why I'm here." "Jamal, in the course of the proceedings, we learned the full extent of what our mother had planned for you, the responsibilities she was preparing you for, the work she hoped you'd continue." Jamal felt a lump form in his throat. Despite everything, he'd grown to care deeply for Evelyn and her causes. The thought that she had seen potential in him, had been grooming him for more than just a trophy husband, was both painful and oddly touching. "Mother's methods were unorthodox, to say the least," Catherine continued, "but her intentions were good. She saw in you the drive and compassion that she felt we lacked. And she wasn't wrong." Catherine reached into her bag and pulled out a thick envelope. "This is why I'm here, Jamal. Mother has established a new charitable foundation. Its mission aligns closely with the work you're doing here, providing opportunities for underprivileged youth, focusing on education and community development." She slid the envelope across the table to Jamal. "She wants you to run it." Jamal stared at the envelope, mind reeling. I don't understand, after everything that happened." "Mother admires your integrity," Catherine explained. "Walking away from a life of luxury because you couldn't live with the deception, that impressed her. She says it proves she was right about you all along." Jamal's hand hovered over the envelope, not quite touching it. "And you, what do you think about this?" Catherine's expression softened. I think my mother is wiser than I gave her credit for. And I think you might be exactly what our family's legacy needs. Someone who understands both struggle and privilege. Someone who won't take wealth and opportunity for granted." The room fell silent as Jamal grappled with the magnitude of what was being offered. It was a chance to make a real difference, to help kids like he had once been. But it also meant stepping back into the world he'd walked away from, dealing again with the complexities of wealth and status. "You don't have to decide right now," Catherine said gently. "Take some time to think about it. Talk it over with your family." Jamal nodded, finally picking up the envelope. "Thank you, Catherine, for bringing this to me and for the apology. It means a lot." As Catherine stood to leave, she paused, turning back to Jamal. "For what it's worth, I'm glad my mother found you. You may not have been the son-in-law I expected, but you might just be the one our family needed." After Catherine left, Jamal sat alone in the conference room for a long time, turning the envelope over in his hands. His mind was awash with memories, his struggles before meeting Evelyn, of the whirlwind months of their unconventional marriage, the pain and liberation of walking away from it all. He thought about the kids he worked with at the center, about how much a foundation like this could do for them. He thought about Evelyn, about the complex tangle of emotions he still felt towards her: gratitude, hurt, affection, and now a new understanding of her motivations. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the conference room windows, Jamal came to a decision. He would accept Evelyn's offer, but on his own terms. He would use this opportunity to bridge the two worlds he had inhabited, to bring the resources of the Whitmore fortune to bear on the real pressing needs of communities like the one he'd grown up in. It wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, skepticism from both sides, and a lot of hard work ahead. For the first time in a long time, Jamal felt like he was on the right path that was truly his own. He pulled out his phone and dialed a familiar number. "Hey, Mom? Yeah, it's me. Listen, something incredible just happened. Remember how you always said everything happens for a reason? Well, I think I finally understand what you meant." As Jamal began to explain the day's events to his mother, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. The journey that had begun with a chance encounter in a coffee shop, taken him through deception, luxury, heartbreak, and back to his roots. Now it was leading him towards a future where he could make a real difference. Evelyn had once told him that she wanted her fortune to be used to continue her philanthropic work, make a real difference in the world. As Jamal looked out at the neighborhood he'd grown up in, the community center where he now worked, he realized that he had the chance to fulfill that wish, not as a pawn in someone else's game, but as his own man, guided by his own conscience and experience. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. As darkness fell over Boston, Jamal Foster stood at the threshold of a new chapter in his life. Past couldn't be changed. The future was full of possibility. And this time, he was ready to face it with honesty, integrity, and a clear sense of purpose. The young black man who had once married an old rich woman for money had found something far more valuable than wealth. He had found his true calling, a way to turn a story of deception into a legacy of hope and positive change. As Jamal locked up the community center and stepped out into the cool evening air, he felt a sense of excitement for what lay ahead. The road wouldn't be easy, but he was ready for the journey. After all, the best stories, the ones that truly matter, are often the most challenging to live. With a smile on his face and determination in his heart, Jamal set off towards home, ready to begin the next chapter of his unexpected, complicated, but ultimately redemptive story.